Philosophy is often deemed too confusing to read or utterly useless. Both are somewhat understandable considering the fact that there's a number of philosophical texts that will leave you in intellectual shambles. But for those of you that prefer fiction or are looking for a more subtle way to get into philosophy, today I'm sharing 5 philosophical fiction books that you need to read. First on my list is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and I feel like this book is very underappreciated and overlooked, probably because most people will turn towards 1984 as the classical dystopian world that predicts much of modern day. But in a similar way, Aldous Huxley presents this dystopian world that I believe accurately predicts modern day much better than 1984, especially when it comes to mass consumerism, this constant pleasure seeking, and even in some ways, this way that the government controls the population, utilizes propaganda, and all of that. Huxley wrote this around the time that Henry Ford and the assembly lines and so forth and this whole industrial revolution were starting to take shape. So a lot of this world is centered around people worshiping Ford as their god, and society is set up in a way where people fall in line and they're actually bred for specific purposes, which I found pretty interesting because we are getting closer and closer to being able to manipulate genetics of babies and create these designer babies. Now, they use it in a pretty scary, frightening, dystopian way where they kind of breed them for certain class structures where, these people are bred to actually think for themselves and be intellectuals and work in the government. And then they have breeds that, or populations that they breed that have lower IQs, and they stunt their growth and they make them only to perform tasks in a facility or a factory and so forth. So it's pretty frightening, but not too far off what our capabilities are today, and specifically things that stand out to me as almost identical to today is this concept of soma, which is their drug, and they have these movie theaters called the Feelies and so forth where people are just constantly distracting themselves from any kind of pain or displeasure or boredom. Everything in this novel, all the citizens are centered around constant pleasure. So if they feel sad, they pop a soma. And a lot of this, we don't have exactly a happy pill today, but we have certainly plenty of drugs and morphine and different options that are going to distract us, whether it is watching Netflix, watching YouTube right now, that's going to distract you from different maybe feelings you have and so forth, and just keep us away from thinking for ourselves in a lot of ways. You see this concept of groupthink and following exactly what you're told and never questioning it in this novel as well. One quote that I found pretty fascinating in the book is where this director says that is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. And although that might sound stark and maybe give you some chills, it's not too far off from what we experience today. There's a lot of conditioning that goes on in this dystopian world, but we're conditioned all the time, right? By what our parents tell us we should do or believe and the expectations they put on us. We have societal expectations to go to college or to do this or do that. We have moral expectations of how we should act and behave and all these factors. And it's not all bad, but it is something to consider. So I really enjoyed reading this. It's not too long of a novel, very fascinating, and certainly relevant to today. Next up on my list is The Stranger by Albert Camus, which is a short read, but a pretty fascinating one nonetheless. You follow this character, Mousseau, where it starts with his mother passing away, and he's at the funeral, and you start to notice he's pretty emotionally detached and isolated in a way. He's more worried about how hot the day is and the sweat beating down his head rather than the passing of his mother and so forth. And if you've read any of Camus before, his whole thing is absurdism, which is like this branch away from existentialism where he posits that there's no meaning or inherent purpose in life and that a lot of life is just random. It's chaotic. Sometimes it's illogical, and it's not always, guided through order and reason. So you notice a lot of just strange actions that occur through Mousseau in this book. There's a situation where I won't spoil it, but he commits a certain act and he says that he doesn't even feel bad about it. He's just annoyed that he did it. And I think sometimes, we can relate to that, right? We don't always choose the right thing. Sometimes we choose the irrational action, or we do something pretty stupid and we go, I don't even feel bad about doing it, but I'm more annoyed with myself. Like, why did I do that? Why did this happen to me? And at the end of the day, we just have to accept that absurdism and absurd things happen in life, and not everything is in our control, and not everything has a purpose and reason. So it's a pretty fascinating book. Again, I think it really ties into all of his other work, so I would advocate that you, when you do pick this up, pick up The Myth of Sisyphus as well. That really explains this idea of the absurd and rebelling against the absurd, and a lot of themes that Camus puts into his novels. So check out The Stranger by Albert Camus. For the third book, we're taking a trip back to the 18th century, and we're going with Candide by Voltaire. And this kind of ties back to the book I just recommended, The Stranger, because both Camus and Voltaire have this critique of religion and this critique of the assumption that everything happens for a reason. So in this story, Voltaire utilizes this character Candide to really exemplify how silly optimism can be. And Candide is this kind of happy-go-lucky character who is constantly faced with these horrific situations, these bad moments, bad luck, suffering, pain. He thinks his love of his life has died, and his greatest professor, Pangloss, has died, and all these different things happen to him. But they're quickly followed by a bunch of good luck. So he kind of goes through these repetitive phases of thinking, oh, this is awful. Maybe things aren't the best of worlds and aren't happening for a good reason. But then quickly, he stumbles upon riches, or something happens where he goes, oh, clearly this is the best of all worlds. Things happen for a reason. There's a good reason for suffering in the world, and so forth. Eventually, you kind of see this cycle play out over and over, and it's pretty entertaining. Some of the stories are pretty comical. Some of them are pretty sad at a time. By the end of the novel, you see what Voltaire is arguing, which is that we must, quote unquote, cultivate our own garden, meaning, things are going to happen to us. It's a chaotic, illogical world, and bad situations will happen to us, and all we can do is make the best of it. But it's a mistake to assume that all the pain, the suffering, the awful, things that happen in this world, genocide and murder, we can't assume that they have a teleological purpose. We can't claim that they have a reason, that it's actually good that bad things happen. Voltaire believes that this ignorant optimism isn't helpful and can be quite harmful. But all in all, Candide is a very entertaining and pretty short book, so I recommend you guys give it a read. Fourth up on the list is The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. And this book walks us through a judge who has spent his entire life living for artificial expectations and arbitrary titles. He's constantly seeking a higher position as a judge, a higher status in society, more wealth, a bigger house, all of this. And as you take a tour through his life, you recognize that he's becoming more and more disconnected from his family members, more self-centered, more egotistic, and all of that. And it really takes a fatal illness for him to realize and become cognizant of these deteriorated relationships and the suffering and his own mortality. So it's a really fascinating novella, not only because it gives us a glimpse into the mental state of a dying man, but also reminds us of our own mortality. And a lot of Tolstoy's commentary of Ivan's struggle with death is a reflection of his own internal struggles. Earlier in the book, you get to see how his peers react to finding out about his death. And they kind of have this attitude and this perspective that, well, that happened to him, but it could never happen to me. And I think a lot of us, go through life, especially when we're younger, and we kind of block out and shield ourselves from the reality of death and the reality that it is inevitable. It's a part of life, and there is no escape. So it gives us a little bit of a sense of humility, awareness of our own mortality, and also looking at how Ivan lives his life and the relationships and how they operate and how they deteriorate. It gives us a better reminder that these levels of status and these wealth and these artificial ways of living, they aren't that meaningful. They don't bring us true happiness. And when we're on our deathbed, we're not worried about how much money's in our bank account. We're not worried about what our job or position was, our title was. We're worried about our family, our loved ones, and we want to look back and feel like we lived a life worth living. So for all of that, although it's a sadder, somewhat morbid read, I think it's worthwhile for everyone to check out this book. And lastly, number 5 is Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, which I think fits pretty well in this realm of existentialism and existentialist thinking. So Dostoevsky describes this underground man as being hyperconscious and very self-critical of himself, and this indecision he wishes was for a specific reason. He specifically says that he wishes the indecision was due to laziness and that he was just a lazy bones and so forth, because then he would have his place in society. He would know why he's this way and what he does, and he'd have this kind of role in society. But because we have this existentialism that's starting to shape culture in the world, and the individual is allowed to define himself and society, the hyperconscious man is kind of lost. He's thinking about all these different opportunities and possibilities that can occur, and because of this, he just feels like an outcast in a lot of ways and isolated from other people in society who know their role, who kind of stay in line, who don't think about these things the way that he thinks about them. In this book, Dostoevsky also has some interesting commentary against rationalism and this idea that if everyone were just to act from pure reason, or were to be educated to act from reason rather than their emotions or human nature, then we could reach this utopian society, right? Where everyone would do what's right because they would have the knowledge to do what's right. But Dostoevsky pushes back a little bit and states that, oftentimes we want to choose the wrong thing, and we choose through our emotions. And he references specifically the underground man has this toothache, and instead of going to a doctor and receiving some kind of medicine, he'd rather just sit in it and sulk in the pain and feel that pain and act irrational. And I think we can all think of different times in our lives where we've chosen to be in suffering and act irrationally, right? Sometimes children will do this. If you just do this, they don't want to listen to their parents. They'd rather just whine and let everyone know they're having a bad time or suffering rather than go to the quick solution. So anyway, very fascinating read. It's always a good time when you're reading Dostoevsky, and this book is no different. So I'd highly recommend you give it a read. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed these recommendations and check them out. I primarily read a lot of philosophical texts that are more straightforward and nonfiction and these treatises and so forth, but if you're like me, you need a little bit of a break sometimes from the rigidity of it and the rigor and all the technicality of philosophy. So sometimes when you mix in a little bit of fiction with some philosophical undertones, it's a bit more enjoyable, and you can kind of give your mind a break before you lose your mind trying to read Kant or Hegel or something like that. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to like it if you did. Drop a comment below. What recommendation would you have for a philosophical fiction book, something I should read or check out? And make sure you subscribe for this content if you liked it, and I'll check you guys in the next one.